Morning in Sage Creek began with the shriek of a train, that metallic scream slicing through the cold air as if tearing dawn itself apart. Steam rose from the iron beast, mixing with the scent of rust and coal smoke, the smell of a land still learning how to become the true West. Leora stood beside a wooden post, her worn coat pulled tight, a wide-brimmed hat hiding half her face. Her long braid was tucked beneath a scarf, dark eyes glinting with quiet caution. She had learned how to wait without hope, for people came and went, but the land always stayed. The letter she'd sent 3 months ago, a simple notice asking for hired help in exchange for food, shelter, and a small share, had finally found an answer. But when the train stopped, she hadn't expected the man who stepped off. Nathaniel Reed did not look like anyone who'd ever set foot here. A long gray wool coat brushed his boots, polished leather shoes caught the sun, and a walnut case swung at his sitoutside. He moved through the dust quietly, but something in his gait betrayed him. A man more used to marble floors than muddy ground. From across the street, men at the water station whistled low, trading suspicious glances. Sage Creek didn't take kindly to strangers, especially tall men with straight backs and eyes that seemed to know too much. Leora stepped forward, her voice hard as the frost clinging to the trough. "You're Reed?" He nodded, removing his gloves. The hands beneath were once soft, now lined with calluses along the fingers. "Nathaniel Reed. I'm here for the work at Vaughn Ranch." She didn't reply, only turned away, her patched hem lifting in the wind. "The horse is waiting outside." The road stretched long between fields gone dry. Charred tree stumps from last year's fire lay scattered, and broken fence posts jutted like old bones. Nathaniel followed in silence, his eyes sweeping over the land, worn, empty, yet hauntingly beautiful. He had read about the West, how opportunity rose from ruin, but no one had told him how heartbreakingly alive it could look. At the last hill, they stopped. Her cabin stood there, weathered pine walls, smoke rising thin from the chimney. Beside it, a half-empty stable, and beyond that, a field drained of color by frost. Nathaniel set down his case, scanning the scene. "More work than I imagined." Leora didn't look back. "If you came to complain, the next train leaves at dawn." He stayed silent, shrugged off his coat, and rolled up his sleeves. His eyes flicked toward her, not challenging, not yielding, but calm, the look of someone who had already lost enough to fear nothing else. They began that morning. Rotten posts, rusted wire, a hammer gone dull. Nathaniel drove the first stake into frozen soil, sweat tracing lines down his neck. Leora let out the stallion, checking the water trench. When she bent to test the flow, her scarf slipped, revealing a faint scar across her shoulder, a story he didn't need to ask. He paused for a moment, then kept swinging the hammer. The sound rang through the wind, a reply made without words. By dusk, they sat beside the half-mended fence. The sun pressed gold against the ridge, painting the plain in fading light. Leora poured him water, her tone softening, but still guarded. "I don't need anyone's pity." Nathaniel wiped his brow, eyes on the horizon. "I didn't come here looking for pity." They met each other's gaze once more, long, wordless, and in that silence, something subtle shifted. As they walked back, their shadows stretched long across the dirt road. The old dog at the door barked once, then settled. The air carried the scent of coming snow. Nathaniel hung his hat, stepping into the dim kitchen where the fire burned low. On the table sat a framed photograph, a black man in uniform, smiling gently. Nathaniel knew at once who he was, her husband, and he understood. Love here never died. It simply turned to dust and memory. That night, Leora sat by the window, the lamp's glow brushing her face. Outside, Nathaniel worked by lantern light, fixing the stable door, his silhouette moving steady through the fog. For the first time in years, she felt the quiet hum of something returning. Not safety, not yet hope, but the echo of trust she thought she'd buried. The woman who no longer trusted anyone, and the man who no longer trusted himself. Their story began there, with a glance, a breath, and the land that would teach two broken souls how to plant something new within themselves. The sun in Sage Creek did not rise gentle like it did back east. It tore its way up, harsh, unyielding, slicing through the scorched ridges and striking straight into the eyes of those stubborn enough to stay. Nathaniel learned that the next morning when he started his work, nothing out here gave itself freely, not even breath. The earth was cracked, the wind fierce, the well water murky and metallic. The fence that bordered Leora's ranch stood half collapsed, jagged like a row of rotten teeth. Nathaniel began driving the posts back in, his palms blistering, sweat mixing with dust until it turned to mud on his skin. She said little, standing a short distance away, pointing only when his angle was off, reminding him to steady his swing. When he finished the first post, she gave a small nod. "Not bad." Her voice was low and rough, like wood rubbing against wood. He didn't answer, just kept working. That was how the two of them survived. No praise, no chatter, only results. By noon, the air carried the scorched scent of grass from the southern flats. Nathaniel paused, squinting toward the horizon. A few lean cattle wandered too far, their ribs visible beneath dull hides. Leora raised her rifle, fired one clean shot into the air. The sound cracked across the valley, and the herd jerked back toward home. Nathaniel watched her, not for the shot, but for the calm that followed. There was something in her stillness he admired, and something in it that warned him not to come closer too soon. Toward evening, they led the horses down to the dry creek bed. The path was littered with stones. The wind smelled of old snow and dust. Leora tied her mare and knelt to wash her hands. Nathaniel crouched beside her, pouring water into the wooden trough. When she reached for the plank that blocked the stream, his hand reached at the same moment. Their fingers brushed, brief, weightless, but enough to stop both hearts for an instant. She withdrew first, turning her face away, but his gaze stayed. In that amber light, no words passed between them, only the sound of water trickling and breath mingling with the scent of wet earth. That night, Nathaniel rode into town for nails and salt. The moment he stepped through the general store door, he felt the stares. Whispers followed. The widow's man. A few quiet laughs. One man spat on the floor. Sage Creek had never been kind to people of color, least of all a black widow who worked the same land once owned by a white man. Nathaniel said nothing. He packed his supplies, paid, and turned to leave. Just before stepping out, he caught a murmur from behind the counter. "That woman's cursed. No white man lasts long at her ranch." He didn't turn around, only tightened his grip on the nail sack until the veins rose sharp and blue along his hand. When he returned, Leora sat on the porch, a cup of coffee steaming in her hand. the firelight from inside softening her features into a copper glow. He set the sack down on the table and said quietly, "The folks in town aren't too welcoming." She replied flatly, "I know, but they're not the ones paying my debts." He almost said something more, but she rose, stepped inside, her footsteps light yet firm. Night settled deep. Nathaniel stayed on the porch, watching the new fence stand in silence beneath the moon. Then he understood why she had survived here. This land spared only those who could endure it. And she, that woman, was part of it now. Hard, closed, yet burning quietly beneath the surface, like fire buried in coal. He looked up and saw her at the window, watching him. No greeting, no nod, just her eyes, cold at first, then slowly softening, like soil after the first spring rain. In that still night, both of them knew. This land forgave no one, but if they stayed long enough, maybe, just maybe, it would learn to let them belong. The first storm of the season came without warning, as if the land itself wanted to test whether these two souls truly belonged to the wilderness. By noon, the clouds had darkened along the horizon. Thunder rolled far away, and the wind began to howl through the half-mended fences. The air smelled of metal, wet straw, and the fear of horses who could sense what was coming. Leora ran out into the yard, her skirt whipping in the wind. "Get the horses inside!" she shouted, her voice nearly swallowed by the gusts. Nathaniel grabbed the oil lamp, its flame flickering wildly as he ran. Together they pushed and pulled, the last stallion rearing high, the rope slipping through their hands. Nathaniel lunged forward, catching it just in time, mud splattering across his shirt as the rain broke loose. Wind roared like a beast, rattling the wooden eaves. "Hold the door!" Leora called, her soaked hair plastered against her face. They shoved together, shoulders braced, forcing the swollen latch into place. Rain hammered down their backs, cold and relentless, but their hands did not stop. A flash of lightning split the sky, and in that moment Nathaniel saw her face. Dark eyes blazing, steady, unafraid. He realized then she had weathered storms before, and always alone. When the doors were finally secured, they stood gasping for breath in the dim stable. The lamp's glow trembled. Rain streaked silver beyond the doorway. Their heartbeats fell into rhythm with the drumming rain, lost in the noise. Leora bent to check the horses, her fingers trembling from the cold. As she rolled up her sleeve, the lamplight caught a thin, pale scar crossing her wrist. An old wound, almost forgotten. Nathaniel froze. He didn't speak, but his eyes lingered a second too long, enough for her to know he'd seen. She pulled the sleeve down, her voice quiet. "Don't pity me." "No," he said softly. "I just think you've survived more than I realized." She didn't reply, only turned away, her shoulders shaking slightly. Nathaniel took off his heavy coat and laid it across her shoulders. She startled, about to protest, but he said simply, "It's just a coat. I've got another." The rain poured on, hard and endless. They stood side by side in silence, the lamp flickering, steam rising from the damp straw. Outside, the world was being torn apart by wind, but in that small space, time had stopped. When the storm finally passed, only the soft drip of water remained. Pale light broke through the thinning clouds. They opened the stable doors and stepped into a world washed clean. Fences bent, branches strewn across the yard. But neither of them spoke a word of complaint. Nathaniel lifted a fallen post, setting it upright with raw, reddened hands. Leora knelt beside him, steadying it. Their fingers brushed. Not intentional, not avoided. The warmth passed between them, quiet and real. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" "For not asking." He gave a small nod, kept hammering. The wind after the storm smelled of wet earth, softer, purer. In the thin mist, he saw her standing still, gazing toward the distant mountains, her eyes far away but no longer cold. That evening, they sat before the hearth. Neither mentioned the storm nor the scar. Only the crackle of the fire filled the silence, its warmth painting their tired faces in gold. Somewhere within that quiet, a fragile trust began to form, like a spark catching in the dark. Nathaniel poured hot water into her cup and slid it toward her. Leora took it, her hand still trembling slightly. For the first time when their eyes met, there was no wall between them. Outside, the wind had calmed. The moon pushed through a veil of drifting cloud. The sky opened again, and with it, perhaps their hearts, just a little. The first storm had passed, leaving not just mud on the ground, but something new, unnamed, alive. Nature had tested them, and they had endured, not merely for the roof above their heads, but because they had begun, at last, to truly see each other. In early June, Sage Creek traded its cold for a punishing sun, the kind that showed no mercy, not even to the sky. Nathaniel stepped out just as dawn broke, a hammer slung over his shoulder and a sack of nails at his side. He'd promised Leora he would rebuild the entire northern fence before autumn, the flattest stretch of land, and the one the wind tore through hardest. A fence, just wood and wire to some, but here, it was the line between survival and loss. It kept the cattle in, and perhaps something else, too. The fragile belief that this ranch still mattered. Nathaniel began measuring the breaks, marking the ground with care. Posts too shallow, he redrove deeper. Wire too weak, he mended by hand. By the time the sun stood high, sweat had salted his neck in white dust. Leora appeared around noon, a water jug in hand, her hair tied up, her hem brushed with dirt. She didn't speak, only set the jug down beside him and knelt to inspect the wire. "You're running it too close to the ground," she said. "When snow comes, it'll vanish under it." Nathaniel followed her gesture, voice low. "I suppose I'm still used to things being even." "The West isn't even," she said. "Out here, everything's uneven, even the people who survive it." That made him laugh quietly. The first time his smile wasn't tinged with irony, but ease. She turned to leave, the faint scent of pine lingering behind her. By late afternoon, he worked alone again. The hot wind swept through the fields, lifting the dust into small, swirling ghosts. He looked up at the fence stretching straight and solid across the plain. Each post like a new heartbeat driven into the land. When the final stake was set, Nathaniel sat back on the ground, face to the sky. The wind whistled through the new wire, humming like strings tightening on a distant instrument. For the first time since leaving Boston, he felt something close to peace. Liora came near sundown, carrying a small basket, roasted potatoes, a loaf of cornbread still warm. He looked up, his face bronzed by the day's work, but his eyes alight. "Consider it a reward," she said, placing the basket down, her tone pretending not to care. He smiled faintly. I've been given bread before, when I won a case, never for building a fence. She glanced at him, half teasing, half curious. A lawyer? No, accountant, for a trading company in Boston. She said nothing. The wind caught her hair, bringing with it the scent of ash and dry grass. Nathaniel's gaze dropped to the dirt. I signed papers I didn't read closely enough. They called it fraud. Said I was complicit. I lost everything. My father died before I could clear my name. The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Leora sat beside him on a fallen beam, eyes on the new fence running straight toward the horizon. I lost everything too, she said softly. The difference is no one ever forgave me. They sat there, two silhouettes in the fading light, not looking at each other but understanding all the same. Crickets sang from the grass, and the sky deepened into a burnt copper glow. By nightfall, Leora lit a fire in the yard. Nathaniel was still out by the fence, driving a few more posts. Not because he needed to, but because he wasn't ready to go inside. The kitchen fire cast a soft orange glow on her face through the window, her eyes reflecting the molten hue of the coals. She wrapped the cornbread in a clean cloth and brought it outside. Eat. You've worked since sunrise. He took it without thanks, and they sat side by side, separated only by a plank of wood, the fire popping softly between them. The air no longer carried distance, only a quiet calm, like the pause between storms. Nathaniel broke off a piece, the butter melting on his tongue, simple and true. It's been a long time since anything's tasted real. Leora lowered her gaze, fingers tightening on her skirt. This land isn't kind, she murmured, but it doesn't lie. He looked at her then, so long, silent, not with doubt, but respect. Beyond them, the night wind swept through the new fence, its sound even and steady, like a living breath. In that moment, both understood. The wall between them had lowered, and the fence beyond, once a barrier, had become a symbol of something they were slowly, quietly learning to build together. Autumn came to Sage Creek without gold or grandeur, only a slow, steady sunlight that lay across the ripening barley fields. Each stalk bowed heavy under its own weight, the wind passing over them in waves that looked like the land itself was breathing. Leora and Nathaniel worked side by side from dawn, shoulders brushing in the quiet rhythm of people who understood that work was sometimes the only way to speak of trust. She cut. He gathered. Their hands were roughened and blistered, yet each accidental touch, when they lifted the same bundle or tied the same rope, carried a silent current between them. Neither mentioned it, but both felt it. Something unseen was growing in that space, like a seed deep in soil, waiting only for time to take root. By late afternoon, the sun tilted low behind the ridge, painting the fields in bronze. Nathaniel drove the cart heavy with barley back toward the yard. The air was thick with the smell of straw, sweat, and faint ash. Leora sat on the porch, wiping her brow, her face sun-darkened and calm. He looked at her and, for a fleeting moment, felt a peace he had never known. But peace in this land was a fragile thing. The rumors started in town. One evening, Nathaniel rode to the saloon to sell the first load of grain. Laughter rolled through the smoke-thick air, low and mean. "The widow and her hired man," one man sneered. "Heard she keeps him warm through the winter." More laughter followed, sharp and cruel as a whip crack. Nathaniel turned, his gaze cold as steel. "Say that again." The man raised his glass, slurring. "We're only saying what everyone sees. That colored woman's not lonely out there." The sound of Nathaniel's fist hitting flesh was like a hammer against stone. A table crashed, chairs flew, glass shattered. By the time the barkeep dragged them apart, blood was trickling down his collar, his jaw burning. But in his eyes, only fire remained. He couldn't remember leaving, only the ride back through the dark, the horse carrying him home. The door opened to warm yellow light. Leora stood there in her shawl, hair loose, worry shadowing her face. "What happened?" He didn't answer. The smell of blood and whiskey filled the room. When she saw the bruise along his cheek, her eyes flickered. Not just with concern, but something like disappointment, too. She said nothing more, only fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth. "Sit." The water was warm, scented faintly of soap. Her hand touched his jaw, steady and careful, wiping away the blood. Her fingers grazed the bruise on his cheek, pausing at the line of his jaw. "Who did this?" "A man not worth naming." "And you hit back?" "Yes. For me." Nathaniel met her gaze, unflinching. "Because they were wrong." She set the cloth down, voice low but firm. "Don't do that again." He frowned. "You want me to let them speak like that?" "No. I want you to stay." The chokon. Words cut quietly, clean and deep. "Just stay," she repeated, slower now. "Out here, people never stop talking. They talk when a woman lives alone. They talk when she gets help. They talk when she dares to smile. But I survived. Not because they went silent, but because I stopped listening." Nathaniel said nothing. Her breath brushed against his skin. The faint scent of smoke and warmth lingered. He realized he'd never been tended to like this before. Not with pity, not with desire, but with a calm presence that made his chest ache. When she finished, he caught her wrist lightly, afraid to break the fragile thing forming between them. "Leora." She pulled free gently, shaking her head. "It's late. Rest." She turned away, her slender figure disappearing into the soft glow of the firelight. But before the door closed, she looked back once more. "Thank you for caring," she said quietly. "But here, all we need to do is survive. Everything else, the wind can carry." When she was gone, Nathaniel remained by the fire, its light flickering over his hands, still stained with dried blood. Outside, the night wind moved through the barley fields, whispering in low, endless waves, a language he couldn't yet understand, but one that made him believe, for the first time in years, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The first rain came to Sage Creek on a night no one was ready for. Wind screamed through the new fences, hurling needles of cold water against the windows. Nathaniel was on the roof of the stable when the first thunder cracked overhead. Old boards tore loose, nails popped from swollen wood, and rain poured down like a broken river. Leora ran from the house, rain soaking her coat, her hair hanging in heavy strands. "The roof won't hold," she shouted over the roar. "Inside, now!" Nathaniel grabbed her hand, pulling her through the flooded yard where water already reached their ankles. They slammed the stable doors shut behind them, and the world outside dissolved into the deafening rush of rain. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of warm horses and damp hay. The lantern on the wall flickered weakly. Nathaniel found a towel and handed it to her. "You're drenched." She sank down on a pile of dry straw, shivering. "And you're not?" He gave a low laugh, shaking his head before crouching beside her. With careful, unhurried hands, he began drying her hair, each motion gentle, as though she might break if he pressed too hard. She looked up at him, eyes glinting dark and alive in the wavering light. The fire's reflection traced the lines of his face, the strong jaw, the quiet eyes that always seemed to be listening more than speaking. "You should have stayed where you belonged," she murmured, her voice trembling, though not from the cold. Nathaniel paused, the towel still between his hands. "I didn't belong anywhere," he said softly. "Not until now." The words silenced her. The rain outside beat harder, matching the rhythm of two hearts caught in the same storm. Neither knew who leaned closer first, only that their breaths mingled and the space between them vanished like mist. His fingers brushed her cheek, cool at first, then steady. She closed her eyes when his lips found her forehead, then her temple, then, finally, her mouth. The kiss was not urgent. It was a confession, a question, and an answer all at once. It was what two fractured souls gave each other when words were too small. Leora didn't pull away. Her hand rose to his collar, trembling as it gripped the wet fabric. His shirt clung to his chest, the scent of rain and skin filling the air. Their breaths merged. The lantern light swayed, sliding across her brown skin like honey under stormlight. When he whispered her name, his voice hoarse beneath the rain's rhythm, she opened her eyes. "We shouldn't," she breathed. But the words dissolved as his lips found her throat. "Then tell me to stop." She didn't, and he understood. They found each other in the storm like travelers recognizing home. Every touch was a confession, his hand tracing the line of her spine, her breath trembling against his chest, the sound of rain colliding with the sound of their own. The air filled with half-formed words and the small, sharp silences between them. Liora lifted her head, meeting his eyes through strands of wet hair. The lantern threw their shadows on the wall. Two figures fused, flickering, fragile as a flame fighting against the wind. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside there was a stillness that felt almost sacred. There was no longer the question of who saved whom, or who needed whom more. There was only this, the warmth, the breath, the pulse of two hearts finding the same rhythm. When the rain eased, dripping softly through the holes in the roof, Leora lay still, her head resting against his chest. Nathaniel's arm curved around her, his thumb tracing the place where her old scar had been. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. Some things were meant to be touched, not told. The lantern's flame shivered and died, leaving only the hush of rain and their mingled breathing. That night, beneath the restless sky of Sage Creek, two people who had lived too long in loss found where they truly belonged, not in promises, not in tomorrow, but in that one unguarded moment when the rain finally learned to fall gently. Dawn came slow, as if the sky itself hesitated to break the quiet left behind by the storm. The first light slipped through the gaps in the stable wall, painting long streaks of gold across the damp earth. Leora opened her eyes and found Nathaniel beside her, one arm resting loosely over her shoulder, his breath deep and steady. She lay still for a moment, watching the dark curls fallen across his forehead. His face softened in sleep. so different from the hardened man she saw in daylight. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil, heavy, raw, alive. Her heart beat slow, caught between warmth and fear. The storm had passed, but what had happened between them lingered, as real as his breath against her skin. She rose quietly, wrapping the blanket around herself. Morning light brushed across her shoulder, revealing the pale scar that ran along her collarbone, a trace of all she had survived. Nathaniel stirred, eyes opening. They looked at each other. No words. Just a moment of truth neither could deny. Liora bent down, picked up his shirt from the floor, and placed it in his hands. "The rain stopped," she said, her voice calmer than she felt. He nodded, pulling the shirt on without meeting her gaze. Between them, there was no awkwardness, only a silence dense and honest. When he stepped outside, Nathaniel paused on the porch, drawing in the post-storm air. The smell of mud, green grass, and faint smoke. The sky had softened into silver. Raindrops clung to every fence post. A horse snorted in the stall. Everything looked washed clean. He rolled up his sleeves and went to work, as he always did, without question, without command, as if nothing had changed. The hammer hit the wet ground with a dull, steady thud. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat. Inside, Leora stood by the window, the curtain shifting with the breeze. She watched him, tall, broad-shouldered, the morning sun glinting off his damp hair. He didn't look back, but something in the way he moved told her he knew she was there. She poured herself coffee, set the cup on the table, and didn't drink. Her chest felt full of something she couldn't name, part calm, part fear. Calm because she knew he wouldn't leave today. Fear because she knew if he ever did, she wouldn't be the same woman who'd learned to live without anyone. She could still hear his voice from the night before. "I didn't belong anywhere. Until now." The words lingered, soft but relentless. When Nathaniel came back to the porch, she was standing in the doorway, sunlight tracing the warm bronze of her skin. Their eyes met, not as strangers, not quite as lovers, but as two people who had discovered something too vast to define. He took off his gloves, voice quiet. "I'll fix the stable roof today. If it rains again, it won't leak." She nodded. "I can help." "No need. I'm used to working alone." Her gaze drifted toward the fields, still wet and glistening. "People who work alone," she said softly, "wear themselves down eventually. I did." He froze, the hammer mid-air. For the first time, something in her tone made him set it down. Leora stepped closer, the hem of her dress brushing the wet earth, the faint scent of rain still clinging to her. She stopped behind him, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. The warmth of her touch held him still. "You don't have to work alone." The words were simple, without plea or command, yet they carried the weight of every winter she had endured alone, every empty night that howled through her hollow house. Nathaniel turned, his gaze meeting hers, and in that instant, the fear between them dissolved like morning mist. A sparrow rose from the fence, wings slicing the silver air. Liora followed it with her eyes and smiled faintly. And in that tender morning, with the earth still damp and their hearts still learning how to trust, they both understood. What had happened in the storm was more than rain. It was the beginning of a new season in their lives, where she no longer feared, and he was no conqueror alone. The first winter wind swept through the Sage Creek Valley, carrying the scent of iron and damp earth. All morning the sky had hung heavy, the gray clouds curling low as if warning of something coming. Nathaniel stood in the pasture, scanning the field. 9 cattle left. One was missing. The white-horned cow, the strongest of the herd. He tied his horse and studied the ground. Tracks led north, toward the road to town. The wind had begun to blur the prints, but one set of boot marks remained clear. Not an accident. Not an animal. Someone had taken it, and Nathaniel already knew who. The men he'd heard whispering at the saloon, the ones who couldn't stand that a black widow dared to keep her land when others said she should have lost it long ago. When he returned, Leora was stacking wood on the porch. "We lost one," he said simply. She looked up. "Probably wandered off. It'll come back." "No, I saw tracks. Human." Her hand froze midair. "You mean someone took it?" He nodded. "And if they took one, they'll come for the rest." The air between them thickened. She looked at him, eyes dark with fear and exhaustion. "What do we do?" "We hold the land. I'll keep watch tonight. If they come back, I'll stop them." She shook her head. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I don't want blood spilled here, Nathaniel. It won't be blood, just a warning. If we don't stand up, they'll erase us like we never existed." Leora stared at him, searching his face, the man she had once begun to trust, now speaking in the voice of war. "I lost my husband to a gun," she said, her eyes shining. "Thomas died proving he wasn't weak. I won't watch another man die to defend what's mine." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "It's not just yours, Leora. It's life itself. It's what we've built. Every nail, every wound, every hour we've bled into this place. But it's not worth a life." He stepped closer. "Are you talking about me or about yourself?" The question hit like a crack in the air. Liora stood still, breath caught. "I'm talking about what's left after you lose everything," she whispered. "Maybe this time you won't lose. Not if you stay and fight." "No. I've lived long enough to know. People like me don't win out here." Her voice trembled, but her gaze didn't waver. "I'll sell the land. Morrison's been asking for months. We could start somewhere else. Safer." "Sell?" Nathaniel let out a hollow laugh. "You'd walk away after everything we've built?" "I'd live," she said simply. The words fell between them like a blade. Neither spoke. The fire popped and cracked in the hearth, but couldn't warm the room gone cold. Nathaniel's voice dropped low. "I thought you stopped running." "And I thought you understood," she said, her voice breaking, "that I can't bury another man I love." He looked at her, fury and sorrow tangled in his eyes, then turned away. "Maybe you need someone who knows how to obey." That night, Nathaniel packed his things, the worn satchel, his knife, the hammer, a few unfinished boards. Leora stood in the doorway, her shadow stretching across the floor, the lantern light soft on her face, strong and breaking all at once. "You're really leaving?" she asked. "Maybe I should go before I become what you fear." She said nothing. The wind caught her hair, scattering loose strands across her cheek. He put on his hat, led his horse past her without looking back. When the door closed, the lantern in her hand wavered. Its flame flickered across the walls, trembling like the breath of someone holding back tears. Outside, the sound of hooves faded down the road. Leora stood motionless until only the wind remained, whistling through the fence posts they had built together. She didn't call after him, not from pride, but because she knew if she opened her mouth, her voice would break into a sob. That night, the house felt hollow, as if part of its soul had gone with him. On the table, a cup of coffee sat untouched, steam curling once before vanishing into the cold air. That night, the wind shifted. From the northern ridges, low clouds rolled heavy across the valley. Nathaniel had ridden half a mile from the ranch, his horse trotting through the wet, open fields where the moon hid behind fog. He didn't look back, not once. But when the first howl tore through the dark, long, low, and close enough to tighten his chest, his hands moved before his mind did. The reins jerked. The horse halted. Then came a second howl, and a third, from the direction of the stables. He knew that sound. Wolves, and more than one. Without thinking, Nathaniel wheeled his horse around and spurred it hard toward home. The night blurred past him, fences and brush flashing in and out of the fog. Ahead, a faint golden light flickered in the farmhouse window. Leora was still awake. His heart hammered faster than the horse's hooves. As he neared the pasture, he saw them. Shadows circling the barn, sleek and low. 4, maybe 5 wolves. The stench of raw meat cut through the cold air. The horses inside screamed and kicked, hooves pounding the wood. One wolf had already squeezed beneath the fence rail. Nathaniel leapt from his saddle, snatched the torch bundle near the gate, a habit Leora had taught him, and struck a match. Flame burst to life, flaring in the wind. He charged forward, shouting, swinging the torch in wide arcs. Firelight flashed in the wolves' eyes, yellow, feral, waiting. The first one lunged. Nathaniel met it mid-air, shoving the burning end toward its face. The creature shrieked and stumbled back, its fur catching fire before it bolted into the dark. 2 others retreated, but one darted behind him toward the stable door. Nathaniel spun and hurled the torch. It struck the hay pile, flames scattering, catching fast. Light erupted across the yard, fierce and wild. Horses screamed, wolves howled. The storm wind roared through the valley, carrying the scent of fire and fear. The house door burst open. Leora ran barefoot into the chaos, hair loose, coat flying. "Nathaniel! Get inside!" he shouted. "The fire's spreading!" But she didn't listen. She grabbed a bucket, dashed to the well, and ran straight toward him. Together they smothered the burning hay, choking on smoke, their bodies moving in rhythm born of desperation. A wolf broke from the shadows, snarling. Nathaniel caught it with a kick to the ribs, sending it crashing into the mud. It yelped and fled. The others followed, melting back into the darkness beyond the fence. And then, silence. When the last flame died down, Nathaniel stood in the yard, shirt torn, shoulders streaked with soot and rain. The horses trembled, but lived. Leora's breath came in quick gasps, her face smeared with ash. She looked around, at the burnt hay, the cracked lantern, the man before her, and her eyes filled with light. "You came back," she whispered. He gave a weary smile. Didn't see who else was going to keep watch, she stepped closer, her hands trembling as they found his chest. His skin was hot beneath the soot, his pulse steady. "I thought you'd gone for good." "I did," he said softly, breath fogging in the cold air. "Then I heard the wolves. Maybe I don't know how to leave this place." Leora bit her lip, tears spilling freely now. She threw her arms around him, the strength in her body giving way at last. It was not a gentle embrace. It was the kind that came after fear, anger, loss, a breaking open. He held her tight, one arm around her waist, one hand in her hair. His fingers trembled where they touched her. "It's over," he murmured against her ear. "You're safe now." "No," she whispered back through her tears. "It's never been over. Not until you came back." Wind swept through the yard, scattering embers into the air. The faint orange glow danced across her cheeks, turning the wet streaks into silver. Nathaniel looked down at her. The strength, the defiance, the tenderness she tried to hide, and something inside him shifted. What he felt wasn't victory. It was gratitude, that she was still here, that he had a place worth turning back to. He hadn't saved the world, hadn't silenced the cruelty of others. But tonight, he had protected what mattered most. Not the livestock, not the land, but the fragile, rekindled light in her eyes. Leora pressed her face against his chest, her voice faint as a prayer. "I've been afraid for so long, afraid everything I love would vanish." Nathaniel's hand moved slowly along her back. "It won't. Not while I'm here." They stood there in the fading glow, surrounded by the quiet aftermath, the smell of smoke, the whisper of wind. Above them, the clouds parted just enough to reveal a thin ribbon of stars, trembling but real, like faith being born again. That night, Nathaniel didn't save her ranch. He saved her courage. Winter retreated slowly, leaving thin streaks of ice that melted under the gentler sun. The fields of Sage Creek, once hard and gray as iron, softened and began to breathe again, exhaling the scent of wet earth and renewal. Streams trickled back through the rocky crevices, and flocks of birds traced slender arcs across the sky, carrying with them the promise of return. Leora stood on the porch, her hand resting on the flat of her stomach, where new life stirred quietly beneath her touch. She hadn't spoken the words aloud, but Nathaniel already knew. He saw it in her eyes, in the way she paused mid-work with one hand gently over her belly, as if listening for a heartbeat only she could hear. "This land knows how to come back," he said one morning, as they worked side by side tilling the soil by the creek. Leora smiled, her voice low and calm. "Maybe because it's died so many times before." Nathaniel didn't answer. He simply pressed the first seed into the earth, slow and deliberate. Each motion of the hoe felt like a heartbeat, each seed like a prayer whispered to the land. After the storm that had nearly broken them, they chose to stay. There was no more talk of selling, no more mention of the men from town or their threats. Together, they rebuilt, stronger fences, sturdier walls. Nathaniel worked with quiet precision, setting every beam, tightening every wire, as though rebuilding just a ranch, but a faith in something bigger than himself. And Leora no longer let him work alone. She brought water, measured the soil, showed him how to read the wind. They didn't speak much, but their silence had changed. No longer heavy, no longer afraid. It had become the steady rhythm of two people who had found the same breath. In the afternoons when the sun poured gold through the windows, Nathaniel would sit at the small table, writing letters. The pages were thin, his handwriting neat, the ink dark. Each letter bore an address in Boston, the city he had once called home, the city that had broken him, but none were ever sent. He folded each one carefully and placed it in a small wooden box. Perhaps he wasn't writing to anyone at all, only saying goodbye to the man he used to be. One evening, Leora stepped outside and found him repairing the front gate. His shirt clung with sweat, the dust of cedar covering his arms. She brought him a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly with the weight of her growing belly. He looked up, taking it from hers, his gaze steady and warm. "You shouldn't stand in the sun," he murmured. "I'm not afraid of the sun anymore." "I am," he said quietly, his hand closing gently over hers. "Afraid of losing something I couldn't bear to lose again." Her smile was soft but sure. "You won't. Not this time." The days passed into a new rhythm. Mornings in the field, noon beneath the oak, evenings by the fire. Ordinary days, but threaded with a peace neither of them had ever known. No more running. No more fear of what might be taken away. On nights when the wind blew, they lay listening to it pass through the rafters of the new roof. They didn't speak of the past, nor make promises about the future. They simply held hands, content with the quiet certainty of the moment, where everything was real, simple, and enough. When the spring rains arrived, they came gently, pattering against the roof like a song the earth remembered. Liora stood at the doorway, watching the thin silver lines of rain fall over the fields. The scent of soil and life rose around her. She placed her hand on her belly, stroking softly. Nathaniel came up behind her, draped a coat over her shoulders, and stood beside her in silence. A faint rainbow appeared over the fields, light spilling across the freshly turned rose. It wasn't a miracle, just the land doing what it always had, healing itself after the long winter. But to them it was a sign that everything broken could grow again, if only one stayed long enough to see it through. Nathaniel laid a hand on her back, the warmth of it grounding her. "Everything starts again here, doesn't it?" he said quietly. Leora nodded, her eyes distant but soft. "Yes, but this time, we don't have to start alone." The rain stopped. Sunlight touched the fields. The same soil that once bore scars now gleamed like a promise. And in the faint breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers, they both understood something simple and eternal. That life, like love, only ever needs one good spring to return. Winter came quietly the following year. No storms, no biting wind. Only a thin quilt of snow laid gently across the fields like a breath held by the earth itself. The sky over Sage Creek shone pale and clear, and sunlight poured through the small cabin window, spreading gold across the rough-hewn walls they had built together with their own calloused hands. The air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke, warm milk, and pine, the fragrance of a life hard-won and deeply human. On the bed, Leora lay on her side, her breath shallow, sweat clinging to her brow. Beside her, Nathaniel knelt, trembling as he held a newborn in his arms. The child's skin was light brown like honey, a soft halo of curls on her tiny head. Her fist closed around his finger, impossibly small, and in that fragile grasp, she seemed to claim him for all of time. Sunlight caught the child's cheek, reflecting in the tears welling in Leora's eyes. She smiled faintly, her voice hoarse but gentle as the breeze. "Clara," she whispered. Nathaniel looked up. "Clara?" "It was my mother's name," she said. "She used to tell me that as long as the sun keeps rising, everything can begin again. He gazed down at the child, then at the woman before him. The same woman he'd once met at a train platform under a sky of dust and doubt. Now she was looking back at him with something entirely different in her eyes. Not fear, not distance, but quiet trust. "Let me hold her," Leora said softly, reaching for him. He laid the baby in her arms. Clara stirred, releasing a tiny sigh, a sound no louder than a bird's breath. Liora kissed her daughter's brow, then lifted her gaze toward Nathaniel. Light from the window brushed across her face, turning her bronze skin into something radiant. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. "Hear what?" "The wind," she said, smiling. "It isn't cold anymore." Nathaniel didn't speak. He sat on the edge of the bed, his large hand trembling as he brushed a damp curl from her temple. She caught his wrist, pulled it closer, and placed his hand over her chest, where her heartbeat thudded steady and strong. "When you came back that night," she said, her voice barely more than a breath, "I started to believe that maybe God hadn't forgotten me after all." Nathaniel bowed his head until his forehead rested against hers. "Maybe he hadn't," he murmured. "But I didn't come back because of God, Leora. I came back because of you." Outside, the wind carried the scent of new snow. Winter light filled the little room, falling over 3 fragile lives wrapped in warmth and silence. There was no music, no blessing, only the soft rhythm of breath, pure, present, enough. Nathaniel's eyes drifted across the cabin, the wooden crib he had built, the curtains she'd sewn from worn fabric, the old oil lamp that had burned through so many nights of fear and waiting. Every piece bore their touch, a record of the long road they had walked, from fear to faith, from loneliness to peace. He looked back at her. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think home was a place." Leora's tired eyes found his. "And now?" "Now," he said, his voice slow and certain, "I think it's a person." A tear slipped down her cheek, glinting like sunlight on ice. "Then," she whispered, smiling through it, "welcome home." Her words lingered in the still air, soft but unshakable. Clara's tiny breaths evened out, her body sinking deeper into her mother's warmth. Nathaniel placed his hand gently on both of them, mother and child, as if guarding the 2 most delicate truths he'd ever known. Outside, the winter sun slid lower, light spilling across the snow until it glowed gold. The land of Sage Creek lay still, as though, at long last, it had decided to open its heart to a new beginning. No one spoke again. There was no need. Only 3 breaths filled the quiet. The man who had once run, the woman who had once lost, and the child born beneath the light. And in that winter, they gained more than a daughter. They found faith again, in life, in love, in the simple grace of having a place to return to. Years had passed since the morning Nathaniel stepped off that train in Sage Creek. The land that had once cracked under drought now rippled with golden barley fields, the wind moving through them like waves beneath a setting sun. Summer was fading, the light softer now, spilling over the timber house they had built plank by plank, stone by stone, sweat by sweat. On the porch, 2 old souls sat side by side. Leora wore a faded wool shawl. Her hair was streaked with silver, but her eyes still held that deep earthen brown, steady, alive. Nathaniel sat beside her, shoulders slightly bent, his weathered hands folded across his knees. His gaze, though softened by age, was still clear, still grateful. In the yard, children ran barefoot through the grass, laughter ringing across the field. Clara, now a mother herself, called them in for supper. The youngest paused, waving toward the porch. Leora smiled, eyes shimmering with quiet joy. "Look at them," Nathaniel said, his voice low but strong. "This land once refused to grow a single stalk, and now it's full of laughter." She turned to him, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth. "Because you never gave up. And you stopped running." He chuckled softly, nodding. "We've grown old." "Yes," she said, looking toward the fields. "But for the first time, I'm not afraid of time." Evening wind drifted across the porch, carrying the scent of ripe barley and smoke from the kitchen stove. Inside, pots clattered, and Clara's soft humming mingled with the faint notes of Nathaniel's old guitar, the one he had kept through every season. For a moment, everything felt perfectly still, suspended in the quiet fullness of an ordinary day. On the wall behind them hung an old photograph, two young people standing before a half-built house, hands clasped, mud at their feet, the horizon still uncertain. They had feared, lost, fought, and loved. And somehow all those years had distilled into this peace, not to prove, not to survive, only to stay. Nathaniel watched the sun sink beyond the distant ridge, its last light spilling gold across the valley. "If I had to do it all again," he began. Leora placed her hand over his, their fingers locking easily, as if they'd never known another way. "I'd still be waiting at that station," she said. He went quiet for a long while, his smile softening. The evening light traced the wrinkles around his eyes, maps of a life lived fully, of thousands of mornings neither of them had expected to see. His thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, memorizing the bones and warmth beneath his touch. The wind nudged the door open just enough to reveal the yard again, the children tumbling, laughing, one falling, another helping them up before the game continued. Life carried on, as the earth always did. "Do you remember that first day?" Nathaniel asked, voice quiet. "I do," she said. "You stepped off the train, looking like a man who belonged nowhere. And now?" "Now," she whispered, "you belong to everything you touch." Silence followed, deep, content, alive. Above them, a flock of geese crossed the sky, a ragged arrow drifting south. Nathaniel's gaze followed them before returning to the woman beside him, the woman who had once met him with suspicion, who had taught him how to stay, how to believe, how to love. She rested her head on his shoulder. "I still hear the train every morning," she murmured. He smiled. "There's no train here, Leora." "In my heart," she said, "it still stops. And you still step down." The sun disappeared behind the hills, leaving a soft, golden glow on their silver hair, the porch railing, the worn wooden door he'd repaired countless times. For that brief moment, time itself seemed to pause. No loneliness, no fear. Only two people who had walked through loss and found their way back to one another, sitting quietly, watching the world spin on, grateful simply to have stayed. The little house stood firm against the wind, chimney smoke curling toward the rose-colored sky. Children's laughter echoed once more across the fields. And there, between the gold of the barley, the silver of their hair, and the red of the dying sun, they had truly built a home. Perhaps each of us, no matter how many years have passed, knows the feeling Leora and Nathaniel found, that life can open a new chapter just when we believe it's closing. At any age, we can begin again, if only we have the courage to hold someone's hand through the storm. Their story isn't only about love, it's about courage, to trust, to stay, to forgive. On this once barren land, they sowed not just crops, but hope. And maybe that's what makes a house a home. If this story touched you, if you've ever loved, lost, or found peace again, share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your own quiet stories of love and renewal. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, so together we can keep these stories alive. Stories of love, time, and the homes built from kindness.